She had set the table for 2 every anniversary for 7 years. On the 8th, she set it for 1. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but because somewhere between his 7th broken promise and his 8th empty chair, Eleanor Whitmore had finally understood something no one had ever told her. Forgiveness is a gift, not a life sentence. She blew out the candles herself, folded his napkin neatly, and for the first time in 7 years, she did not wait. If this story speaks to your heart, dear friends, please subscribe to our channel, hit that bell, and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 came to Virginia the way it always did, slow and heavy, draped in heat that pressed down on everything like a hand that refused to let go. The magnolia trees along the drive of Whitmore Plantation stood wide and white and breathless. The fields stretched out beyond the fences in long golden rows. And inside the great house in the formal dining room on the 2nd floor, a woman named Eleanor Whitmore had been standing at the window for 3 hours, watching the road, waiting for a carriage that was not coming. The table behind her was set perfectly, every candle lit, every glass polished until it caught the light. The meal she had spent 2 days preparing sat untouched: the roast pheasant, the herb bread, the summer berry tarts that Nathaniel had loved since they were first married. A small wooden box wrapped in green ribbon sat at his place at the head of the table. Inside it, a pocket watch she had searched 6 months to find the very one he had admired in a shop window in Richmond, and then forgotten the way he forgot most things that were not political in nature. And in the center of the table, a handwritten letter, 7 pages long. 7 years of marriage, 1 page for each year. Not an accusation, not a complaint. Just the truth written in her careful hand about who they had been to each other and who she had hoped they might still become. Eleanor pressed one hand flat against the glass of the window. The road was empty. It had been empty since 6 o'clock. It was now past 9. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Light ones. Her younger brother-in-law, James Whitmore, appeared in the doorway. He was 22, with Nathaniel's same dark eyes, but none of his elder brother's careful composure. James wore his feelings directly on his face, which was something Eleanor had always appreciated about him. Right now, his face said everything he was trying not to say out loud. Eleanor. He stopped at the threshold. He looked at the table, at the candles burning low, at the untouched food, at the box at Nathaniel's empty chair. I'm sorry. I don't know what to... Don't apologize for him, James, she said quietly, without turning from the window. You never need to do that. He sent a messenger, James said. An hour ago. There's a meeting at Governor Randolph's. Something about the Western Territories and the land negotiations. He said... James stopped. What did he say? Eleanor asked. Silence. James. Her voice was still quiet, still even. What did he say? She heard the young man exhale. And then quietly, reluctantly, she heard him repeat the words that would live in her chest for the rest of her life. She'll forgive me like always. Eleanor did not move. She did not flinch. She simply stood there at the window with her hand on the glass and let those 5 words settle into her like stones dropping into still water. She'll forgive me like always. Not, I'm sorry, please tell her I love her. Not, this is the last time, I promise. Not even tell her to save me some supper. Just, she'll forgive me like always. As if her forgiveness were a thing he kept in a drawer somewhere. A certainty. A convenience. Something he could count on the way he counted on the sun rising, and the rent being collected, and the seasons turning in their proper order. Thank you, James, she said. You can go. Eleanor, please. She heard him hesitate, heard his boots shift on the floor. For what it's worth, he said very quietly, I think you deserve better than this. I've always thought so. She did not answer. She heard him leave, and then she was alone. For a long time, she simply stood there. The candles behind her threw long shadows across the walls. The summer night pressed warm and dark against the glass. Somewhere out beyond the trees, a whippoorwill was calling the same plaintive repeated cry over and over, as if it too were waiting for something that was not coming. Eleanor turned. She looked at the table. At the 7 years of effort assembled there in silver and crystal and candlelight and green ribbon. At the letter she had spent 4 evenings writing, and 2 more evenings revising, because she wanted to get it right, wanted to say exactly what she meant, without cruelty, without bitterness, with only honesty and yes, love. Still love. Even now. Even after 7 years of anniversaries spent alone. She walked to the head of the table. She picked up the letter. She read the first line. Just the first. Nathaniel. I have spent 7 years learning the shape of your absence. She folded it. Once, twice, 3 times, until it was small enough to fit in her palm. Then she walked to the fireplace and held the letter over the flame. She held it there for 5 full seconds. And then she pulled it back. She did not burn it. Instead, she placed it in the pocket of her dress. She lifted the wooden box from his chair and set it in the sideboard drawer, closed the drawer carefully. She walked the length of the table, snuffing each candle with her fingertips as she went one by one, the small sharp sting of each flame, a thing she barely felt. When the room was dark, she stood in the center of it for a moment. Then Eleanor Whitmore, who had forgiven her husband 7 times more than she should have walked up the stairs, went into the bedroom they shared, and for the first time in 7 years, locked the door. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark, and she thought with a clarity she had not felt in years about a conversation she'd had with her mother before the wedding. Her mother, a practical woman, a farmer's wife who had known hard seasons, and harder men had taken her hands and said, "Eleanor, when you choose a husband, look for the man who shows you who he is before he needs to impress you. Because after the wedding, the impression stops, and you'll be left with the man underneath." Eleanor had been 20 years old and in love with a bright, handsome, ambitious young Virginian who had ridden up to her father's fence on a bay horse and asked her name like it was the most important question he'd ever posed. She had thought her mother was being unromantic. She understood now. She understood so clearly it almost made her laugh. Nathaniel Whitmore was not a bad man. That was the thing, that was the part that made this so impossibly difficult. He was not cruel. He was not cold. He did not raise his voice or spend his money recklessly or keep company with questionable people. He was, by every measure that society had designed for measuring such things, an excellent husband. He provided handsomely. He was respected. He was charming at dinner parties. He sent flowers when he forgot things, and he always sent very good flowers. But he was not present. He had not been present. Not truly present. Not the kind of present that means, "I see you. I am here. Tell me what you're thinking." Since somewhere around the 3rd year of their marriage, when his political career had begun to eclipse everything else, the way a summer storm eclipses the sun. Slowly at first, and then all at once, until Eleanor had realized one morning that she could not remember the last time her husband had looked at her and actually looked. She was the landscape. She was the given. She was the constant, reliable, forgiving backdrop against which Nathaniel Whitmore performed his great and important life. And she had allowed it. That was the part that sat hardest in her chest as she lay in the dark. She had allowed it. Every time he had sent flowers instead of himself, she had forgiven him. Every time he had missed a dinner or a birthday or a quiet evening, she had planned forgiven. The morning he had forgotten that her father died, and she had stood alone at that graveside, because the messenger didn't reach him in time, she had forgiven that too. Eventually, after crying for 3 days in the garden where no one could see her. She had forgiven so much for so long that she had made it easy for him. She had made his neglect comfortable. And somewhere in the long arithmetic of her patience, she had lost track of when forgiveness had crossed over into something else. Something quieter and more dangerous. Acceptance. Margaret Dawson was the housekeeper of Whitmore Plantation. She had been housekeeper there for 31 years, through the marriage of Nathaniel's parents, through his childhood, through his father's illness and death, and through every year of Nathaniel and Eleanor's union. She was 60 years old and had the upright posture of a woman who had spent decades walking long corridors and making things right. She knocked on Eleanor's door at 7 o'clock the next morning. Mrs. Whitmore. A pause. I'm awake, Margaret. Mr. Whitmore's carriage came through the gate 20 minutes ago. He'll want breakfast. Shall I? Set one place, Eleanor said from behind the door. Just one. I'm not hungry this morning. Another pause. Margaret had been in this household long enough to understand exactly what a locked bedroom door on an anniversary morning meant. She had been witness to 7 years of small accumulating heartbreaks. She was not a woman who interfered in the business of her employers. But she stood in that hallway for one moment longer than necessary. Mrs. Whitmore, she said quietly, are you all right? The silence that followed lasted long enough that Margaret placed her hand flat against the door the same way you might place your hand on the shoulder of someone who is trying very hard not to cry. I will be, said Eleanor's voice, low, even, with a steadiness that Margaret recognized after a lifetime of service as the steadiness of a woman who has decided something. Yes, ma'am, said Margaret, and walked away. Nathaniel came up the stairs at 7:30. He was still dressed from the night before, coat rumpled, cravat loosened, the particular dishevelment of a man who had been up all night in a room full of other important men talking about important things. He was carrying a bunch of yellow roses he had stopped to buy from a roadside seller on the way home. He was smiling. Not a careless smile, not quite. Nathaniel Whitmore was not a careless man. He felt genuine remorse. He always did. He would come up these stairs and find Eleanor reading or sitting quietly, and she would look at him with those gray eyes that never quite accused him of anything, and he would hold out the flowers and say, I'm sorry, Ellie. The meeting ran long, and she would take the flowers and say, It's all right, Nathaniel, and it would be all right. It was always all right. That was what made it possible to do again. Because it was always all right. He raised his hand to knock on the bedroom door, found it locked. His hand stilled. He knocked once. Eleanor. Nothing. He knocked again, louder. Eleanor, I'm home. I know last night was... I know I missed the dinner and I'm sorry. Truly. I brought... He glanced at the roses in his other hand. I brought you something. Silence from inside the room. He felt the first small chill of unease. Eleanor, come now. Open the door. Nothing. Eleanor. His voice changed slightly, a shade more authoritative, the tone he used in committee rooms when he needed to redirect a conversation. I understand you're upset. You have every right to be. Open the door and we can talk about it properly. The lock clicked. The door opened. Eleanor stood in the doorway. She was dressed, fully dressed, not in a morning wrapper, but in her blue traveling dress, the one she wore when she was going somewhere. Her hair was pinned up. A small leather bag sat on the floor beside the wardrobe. She looked at him with those gray eyes, and she did not look angry. She looked tired. The particular profound, bone-deep tiredness of someone who has been awake all night reaching a conclusion. Nathaniel held out the roses. She looked at them. She looked at him. She said, Nathaniel, how many flowers have you sent me in 7 years? He blinked. I what? I counted once, she said in that quiet, even voice. 63 bouquets, in 7 years, every time you forgot something, every time you didn't come home when you said you would, every time I was somewhere alone, where I had hoped you'd be beside me. She looked at the yellow roses again. 63 bouquets. Eleanor, do you know what I would have given for just one evening, she said. Just one. Not flowers, not a note of apology. Just you, present, asking me about my day, sitting beside me on the porch after dark. One evening, Nathaniel. I have responsibilities. I know you do, she said, and there was no heat in her voice, which was somehow worse than anger. I have never asked you to abandon them. I have never in 7 years demanded anything of you that you did not offer first. I simply waited for what you promised and forgave you when it didn't come. She paused. And somewhere in all that waiting and forgiving, I think I forgot to remember that I was a person who deserved more than absence. Nathaniel stared at her. The roses felt absurd in his hand now. Where are you going? She reached down and lifted the small bag. Away for a while, she said. I need to think. You can't just Eleanor, this is your home. It is, she agreed, and I'll come back to it. She looked at him steadily. But right now I need to be somewhere you aren't, so I can remember who I was before I became so good at forgiving you. The words landed precisely. He felt each one. This is your being. He stopped himself, breathed, tried again. What do you want me to say? I told you I'm sorry. You say it every time, she said softly. And every time you mean it. I know that. But Nathaniel. She looked up at him, and for a moment, the tiredness in her face opened into something raw and unmistakable. Meaning it and changing are two different things. She walked past him. He turned. Eleanor. He caught her arm gently. Please, we can talk about this. Whatever you need me to do differently, just tell me. Tell me and I'll do it. She looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. That's just it, she said. I've been telling you for 7 years, in small ways, in quiet ways, in the ways a woman tells her husband things when she's still hoping he'll notice on his own. She gently removed her arm from his hand. I'm done translating myself, Nathaniel. If you want to know who I am and what I've built and what I've needed, the door is there. It's been open the whole time. She went down the stairs. He heard the front door open. He heard it close. And the house, the grand, well-kept, politically important house of Nathaniel Whitmore, fell into a silence so complete that he could hear the yellow roses in his hand trembling slightly in the draft that came through the hall window. He stood there for a long time. Margaret appeared at the foot of the stairs, looking up at him with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite satisfaction, but something in the middle. The complicated look of a woman who has watched this coming for years and does not know whether to feel sorry for the man or simply let him reckon with what he's done. Where did she go? Nathaniel asked. I couldn't say, sir. Margaret. He came down the stairs. You've been in this household 30 years. Don't tell me you couldn't say. The old woman met his eyes without flinching. What I mean, sir, is that Mrs. Whitmore did not tell me where she was going. And even if she had, a brief pause. I'm not certain it would be my place to say. He stared at her. She's my wife. Yes, sir, Margaret said. She is, and she has been a very loyal one. A beat. For 7 years. The words hung between them like smoke. Nathaniel looked away first. He went into his study and closed the door. He sat at his desk for 2 hours without moving. Outside, the summer day was moving forward without him. The fields going about their business, the household staff going about theirs, the birds in the magnolia trees calling back and forth in the heat. The world was entirely indifferent to the fact that Nathaniel Whitmore had just watched his wife walk out of their house without looking back. On his desk was a stack of correspondence. 3 letters from the governor's office. A report from his estate manager. An invitation to a political dinner in Fredericksburg. He did not look at any of them. He thought instead about what Eleanor had said. I've been telling you for 7 years. In small ways. In quiet ways. What small ways? He genuinely tried to remember. Tried to think of the moments she might have been telling him something that he had not heard. He prided himself a man who listened carefully. It was one of his political gifts, the ability to hear what people were saying beneath what they were saying. But when he reached back through 7 years of marriage, for the small ways Eleanor had told him who she was and what she needed, what he found was gaps. Spaces where she had been present and he had been elsewhere. Dinners he had attended in body, but not in mind. Mornings he remembered as pleasant, but could not have described if asked. She had been there for all of it. He realized with a slow and cold precision that he could not have told anyone what color the flowers were in the garden she tended every summer. Could not have said what books she had read in the past year. Could not have named with any confidence what it was that made her laugh. He knew she managed the household superbly. He knew she was liked by everyone who met her. He knew she was kind and quiet and capable. He did not know her. Not really. Not anymore. He sat with this understanding for a long time. And then, because Nathaniel Whitmore was at his best when he had a problem with a concrete edge, he stood up, went to the door of his study, and called for James. His brother appeared quickly, too quickly, suggesting he had been nearby and listening. He came in and stood across the desk with the slightly braced posture of someone expecting a difficult conversation. "James," Nathaniel said, "tell me about Eleanor." His brother blinked. "I beg your pardon. Tell me about her, what she does, what she cares about, what she's been doing with herself." He paused. "I realize that's a strange thing to ask. I realize I should already know." James looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "You should." "I know that." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Tell me anyway." James sat down in the chair across the desk. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he said, "Nathaniel, has it truly never come up? In 7 years, not even once. Not in enough detail for me to understand what she's actually—" He stopped. "Just tell me, James." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She built something. While you were building your political career, Eleanor built something too. Something real. Something that's already changing the lives of dozens of families in this county." He paused. "And you never even asked." Nathaniel absorbed this. "Start from the beginning," he said. And his brother did. James talked for an hour. He told him about the garden cooperative Eleanor had organized in the 3rd year of their marriage, starting with just a half-acre plot behind the church in the nearest town. A piece of ground the parish had been ignoring for years, which Eleanor had asked permission to use, and then transformed over one season into a working food garden that fed 11 families through the following winter. He told him about how she had gone from there to the abandoned Hadley land along the creek negotiating with the bank herself, presenting her case in the bank president's office, while wearing her best visiting dress and speaking with a calm authority that had apparently left 3 men in business suits temporarily speechless and securing use of the land for community cultivation. He told him about the children, about how Eleanor had started teaching the children of tenant farmers to identify plants, to understand soil, to grow things from seed, about how she had documented everything she learned and sent copies of her notes to other women in neighboring counties who had done the same until there was a loose and growing network of gardens and gardeners spreading quietly across the region. He told him that Thomas Reed, the head gardener of Whitmore Plantation, had been working with Eleanor on all of this for 5 years, had helped her plan it and execute it, and had accompanied her on more than a few of her early visits to skeptical landowners. His steady presence behind her shoulder, lending the kind of wordless authority that the world in 1817 was more likely to receive from a large, calm man than from a woman, any woman, no matter how right she was. "She has a name for it," James said. "The whole cooperative. She calls it the American Living Garden Society." Nathaniel said nothing. "It's in 4 counties now," James said. "Maybe 5, I lose track." Nathaniel sat in his chair with his hands flat on the desk. "5 counties, he said. "Yes. She built this while managing this household, while attending every political dinner I asked her to attend, while—" He stopped. "While waiting for you," James said simply. "And there was no cruelty in it. Just the fact offered plainly. She built all of that while also waiting for you." The afternoon light was moving across the study floor. Outside the window, the heat of the Virginia summer pressed against everything. Nathaniel Whitmore, who had once sat in rooms of powerful men and argued with eloquence and force about the future of the Republic, sat alone in his study and understood that he had been for 7 years exactly as blind as his wife had known him to be. He thought about her at the window the night before. 3 hours waiting. The candles. The supper. The green ribbon. He thought about, "She'll forgive me," like always, the easy confidence of those words, the way they had left his mouth without a second thought, the way he had simply assumed that Eleanor's love was a fixed condition of the universe, like weather and water and the turning of the earth. He stood up. "Where would she go?" he said. "If she wanted to be somewhere she thought was hers, somewhere I wouldn't look." James looked at him for a moment. Then he told him. But Nathaniel did not go that day. Not because he didn't want to. Not because he didn't feel the urgency of it pressing against his chest like something physical. He didn't go because he understood for the first time in 7 years that arriving with flowers and an apology arriving the way he always arrived, confident of forgiveness, confident of the outcome was precisely the problem. He needed for once in his life to come to Eleanor without knowing how it would end. He needed to come, not as the man who expected to be forgiven, but as the man who was finally genuinely trying to understand what he had done. So that night, Nathaniel Whitmore sat alone in the grand dining room where his wife had set a perfect table for two and eaten by himself in the flickering light of the candles Margaret had relit. He ate the food that had been kept warm in the kitchen, the pheasant, the bread, the summer berry tarts, and he ate it slowly, and he sat with all of it, the silence and the empty chair and the weight of 7 years of meals she had prepared that he had not been home to share. He opened the sideboard drawer, found the wooden box with the green ribbon. He stood there for a long time with it in his hands before he finally opened it. Inside was a pocket watch. Gold case. Intricate engraving on the back. He turned it over and his hands went very still. He recognized it immediately. It was the watch he had admired in a Richmond shop window 2 years ago, had stopped in front of it on a November afternoon with Eleanor on his arm and said, "That's a fine piece," and then been pulled away by something, some obligation, some pressing matter, and never thought about it again. She had remembered. She had gone back and found it, and searched for it, and bought it, and wrapped it in green ribbon, and set it at his place at the table for their anniversary dinner. For an anniversary he hadn't come home for. He sat down in his chair, the chair at the head of the table, the chair she had placed that box in front of, and he held the watch in his hands, and he sat there in the empty room as the candles burned low around him. He did not cry. He simply sat, and understood with a clarity that no amount of political success had ever given him exactly what he had been throwing away. The heart that forgives does not do so because it feels nothing. It does so because it loves more than it should, and one day, even the most devoted heart reaches the limit of what love alone can hold. The morning after Eleanor left, Nathaniel Whitmore did something he had not done in 7 years of marriage. He walked through his own house like a stranger, not with purpose, not with the brisk, forward-leaning stride of a man who had somewhere important to be. He walked slowly with his hands clasped behind his back, moving from room to room, the way a man moves through a place he is seeing for the first time, pausing at doorways, looking at walls, picking up objects and setting them back down. He did not know what he was looking for. He found it anyway, in the front parlor, along the east wall. There was a set of shelves he had always registered, only peripherally, the kind of furniture that exists in a house, the way wallpaper exists, present but unexamined. He stopped in front of them now and actually looked. There were books, dozens of them. Not the political histories and legal volumes that lined his study, but field guides, botanical drawings, agricultural treatises, correspondence, compiled into pamphlets, hand-stitched journals, with Eleanor's handwriting visible on their spines in faded ink. Between the books, small objects, a dried flower pressed flat between 2 pieces of glass. A child's drawing of something that might have been a tomato plant, signed in large, uneven letters for Mrs. Whitmore, from Abel, age 7. A folded letter with a broken wax seal. A small ceramic pot with a crack running down one side repaired carefully with what appeared to be a line of gold. He picked up the pot, turned it in his hands. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind him. "The kintsugi pot," she said without preamble. He looked at her. "The what?" "It's a Japanese method, repairing broken things with gold instead of hiding the cracks." She paused. Mrs. Whitmore read about it 2 winters ago. She had that pot repaired herself. Said she liked the idea that something broken could be made more beautiful by the mending, not less. Nathaniel set the pot down carefully. "How much do you know," he said slowly, "about what my wife does outside this house?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Considerably more than you, sir," she said. And her voice was not unkind, but it was not soft either. It was the voice of a woman who had been waiting 31 years for someone to ask the right question. "Then tell me," he said. She told him. She started with the beginning, not the cooperative, not the garden, but before all of that. She told him about the first winter of their marriage, when a drought had devastated 3 of the tenant families on the eastern edge of the Whitmore land. Nathaniel had been in Richmond for most of that winter, engaged in a particularly contentious series of legislative sessions. He had left the management of the estate to his steward as usual, and thought no more about it. What he had not known, what his steward had not reported to him, because the steward reported numbers and yields, and not the private activities of the mistress of the house, was that Eleanor had spent that entire winter negotiating with the families herself, had gone to their homes, had sat at their tables, had inventoried what they had and what they needed, and then had quietly systematically redirected resources from the main house stores, not recklessly, not in ways that would show up obviously in the accounts, but with the precise and careful hand of a woman who understood exactly how much margin she had to work with. 3 families had made it through that winter in better condition than anyone had expected. None of them had known who to thank. They knew, Margaret said. They knew it was her. They just didn't speak of it because she'd asked them not to. She asked them not to. She didn't want you to feel criticized, Margaret said simply. She didn't want you to come home and find that she'd handled something and feel as though she were showing you up, so she asked them to keep it quiet. A pause. That was the first winter. Nathaniel pulled out a chair and sat down. How many winters followed that one? He asked. Every one of them, Margaret said, in one way or another. He was quiet for a long time. Why didn't she tell me? Margaret looked at him steadily. She tried, sir. In the early years. She would bring things up at breakfast, or write to you when you were away. But you were always busy with something more pressing. And after a while... She paused. After a while, she stopped trying to fit her life into the gaps between your important things. She just built her own. The clock on the mantel struck 9. Nathaniel sat with his hands on his knees and stared at the small gold-repaired pot on the shelf and thought about Eleanor reading about Japanese pottery repair in the middle of a Virginia winter alone, by a fire, and thinking, yes, that's the right way to treat a broken thing. He wondered if she had been thinking about the pot when she read it, or about something else entirely. He stood up abruptly. I need to speak with Thomas Reed. Margaret nodded. He's in the East Garden, sir, same as every morning. She said it the way you say a thing that everyone already knows. Everyone, it seemed, except the man who owned the land. Thomas Reed was 53 years old and had the compact, deliberate quality of a man who had spent his life working with things that required patience. He was pulling spent blooms from a rose hedge when Nathaniel crossed the garden toward him. He straightened when he saw him coming, set down his clippers, waited. Thomas, Nathaniel said, I owe you a conversation that's about 7 years overdue. Thomas Reed looked at him. He did not smile, and he did not look alarmed. He simply looked at Nathaniel with the level measuring gaze of a man who has heard many things and judged few people and understood a great deal more than he was ever asked about. Suppose you might, he said. Nathaniel stopped a few feet away from him. I understand you've been working with my wife. On the cooperative. Yes, sir. For how long? Going on 5 years, Thomas said. Though she'd been thinking about it longer than that. We talked about it the first summer you were away in Richmond for 3 months running. She had the idea already drawn out. Had notes. A brief, almost invisible shift in his expression, not quite admiration, not quite reproach, but something that contained both. She's a thorough woman, your wife. Tell me about it, Nathaniel said. All of it, from the start. Thomas Reed looked at him for a moment. He seemed to be deciding something, not whether to tell him, but how much of what he truly thought to let into his telling. Then he said, Better if I show you, sir. Come with me. Nathaniel had expected to walk to a corner of his own estate. He had not expected to walk off it entirely. Thomas led him out through the east gate of the plantation, down the long dirt road toward the town, then off the road and along a creek bank shaded by oaks, then through a gap in a fence line that opened onto a piece of land. Nathaniel recognized distantly as the old Hadley property. A stretch of bottomland that had sat fallow for years passed through 2 bankruptcies and a bank receivership before disappearing from the active map of his concerns. What he found on the other side of that fence stopped him where he stood. There were people everywhere. Not plantation people. Not the kind of organized, directed labor he was accustomed to seeing on managed land. These were family men and women, working side by side. children running between rows, an older woman sitting on an upturned bucket, instructing two younger women in something that involved their hands moving carefully in the dirt. The land was alive, not just planted alive. Organized into sections with clear paths between them, some plots dedicated to single crops, and others mixed in the way of a cottage garden, with vegetables and herbs and flowers grown together in combinations that seemed deliberate and considered. There were simple wooden markers at the end of each row, each one labeled in a careful hand. Eleanor's hand. He recognized it from 7 years of letters he had not read closely enough. She designed this layout herself, Thomas said beside him, based on what she'd read and what she'd learned from the families here. Some of it's French method. Some of it she worked out herself from trial and error. He paused. She's out here 3 mornings a week, more in planting season. 3 mornings a week, Nathaniel said, while you're in your study usually, or on the road. Thomas said it without inflection, simply as information. Nathaniel walked forward slowly into the garden. People looked up as he passed. He was recognizable, a known face in this county, the local assemblyman. A few of them nodded. One man older touched the brim of his hat. A woman he didn't recognize met his eyes briefly and then looked away. He stopped at the edge of one of the center plots where a boy of perhaps 8 was crouched over a seedling with an expression of tremendous concentration. "What are you growing?" Nathaniel asked. The boy looked up. He had the wide, serious eyes of a child who had been told something important and was taking it seriously. "Corn," he said. "Mrs. Whitmore showed me how to check the leaves for when it needs water. She says the plant tells you. You just have to know how to listen." Nathaniel looked at him for a moment. "She's right," he said. His voice came out slightly rougher than he intended. The boy nodded satisfied and went back to his plant. Nathaniel kept walking. He found himself, almost without intending it, at the far end of the garden, where a rough wooden table sat under the shade of an oak tree. On the table was a stack of notebooks, all of them Eleanor's. He opened the top one. He read for 10 minutes without stopping. What he found inside was not the idle record-keeping of a woman passing time. It was a systematic chronicle of everything the cooperative had attempted and learned over 5 years. Crop yields by season, soil conditions. What had failed and why, what had succeeded beyond expectation. There were notes in the margins in smaller writing separate from the main text that he understood. After a moment were responses, other people's contributions, other women's observations. Written in and around Eleanor's original notes, a conversation carried out on paper across county lines. At the bottom of one page in Eleanor's hand, underlined twice, "The ground gives back what you put into it. People do too. The question is always whether you are paying enough attention to see it." He closed the notebook. He stood under the oak tree on a piece of land his wife had brought back to life, and he thought about what Thomas had said. You attended every celebration in newspapers, but never once stood beside her. It occurred to him with a precision that was almost physical that he had been proud of Eleanor for years, in the general ambient way that a man is proud of an attractive house or a well-run estate. He had told people at dinner parties that his wife was remarkable. He had meant it in the way that you mean things you have not examined closely. He had been proud of her the way you are proud of something you own. He had never once thought to be proud of her the way you are proud of someone you actually know. He walked back to where Thomas stood waiting. "Is she here today?" he asked. "No, sir. She hasn't been in since yesterday morning." "Did she say anything to you before she left? About where she might go?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ground, then up at Nathaniel. He seemed to be weighing something. "She said..." He stopped, started again. "When she came out yesterday morning before any of this happened last night, before your anniversary. She was quieter than usual. And at the end, when she was packing up her things to go back to the house, I asked her if she was all right." He paused. "She said, 'Thomas, I think I've been confusing love with endurance for a very long time. I'm not sure they're the same thing.'" Nathaniel said nothing. "I didn't know what to say to that," Thomas continued. "So I didn't say anything. I just watched her go." He met Nathaniel's eyes. "I've been watching her carry a lot of things alone for 5 years, sir. She's a strong woman, but strong people don't have a bottomless supply. They run out too." "I know," Nathaniel said. "Do you?" Thomas asked. And it was not disrespectful. It was the question of a man who genuinely wanted to know whether the man in front of him understood the weight of what he was saying. Because knowing it in your head and knowing it in your chest, those are different things. Mrs. Whitmore knows the difference. She's been hoping you'd find it too. Nathaniel left the garden. He walked back along the creek in the August heat, and he did not think about legislative sessions or land negotiations or the governor's correspondence sitting on his desk. He thought about Eleanor. About the 8-year-old version of Eleanor who had grown up on a farm where you learned early that things required tending and that neglected things died quietly and without announcement. About the 20-year-old Eleanor who had said yes to him in a garden while wearing a blue dress with her hair pinned up in the particular way that meant she was dressed nicely but had been working in the morning. About every year since then that he had been so busy building his important life that he had not noticed she was building one too. I thought about the plant tells you. You just have to know how to listen. He had not been listening. He had not even known there was something to hear. When he got back to the house, James was in the front hallway. His younger brother took one look at him and said, "You went to the garden." "I did." "And?" Nathaniel hung his hat on the peg by the door. He stood with his back to his brother for a moment. Then, "Did you know about all of it? The full scope of what she's built?" "Most of it," James said carefully. "And you didn't think to tell me?" James was quiet. Nathaniel turned. His brother had the expression of a man who has rehearsed an answer and then thought better of it and decided on the truth instead. "She didn't ask me not to," James said. "But she also never asked me to make sure you knew. And the reason I never offered is—" He stopped. Tried again. "Because, Nathaniel, I watched you not ask for 7 years. Every time she was in the room and could have told you herself, and you were somewhere else in your mind. I kept thinking any day now he'll notice. Any day now he'll come home and actually look at his wife and see what she is." He paused. "You never did." The two brothers stood in the hallway in silence. "I'm trying now," Nathaniel said. "I know," James said. "That's the first right thing you've done in a long time." He moved toward the door. "But trying now isn't the same as it not being too late." He left. Nathaniel stood alone in the front hallway of the house that Eleanor had managed and maintained and filled with 7 years of quiet, unnoticed life. He looked at the shelves he had walked past 1,000 times, at the hat stand by the door where her mourning gloves still hung, at the small vase of cut flowers on the hall table. Flowers from her garden, he realized now with a fresh, specific pang that she replaced herself every few days because she knew they made the entryway brighter. He had told guests more than once that Eleanor was wonderful with the household arrangements. He had never asked her where the flowers came from. He went back into his study. This time, he did not sit at his desk. He went to the window that looked out over the side garden, the one Eleanor tended closest to the house. He stood there the way she had stood at the dining room window the night before, and he thought about what it meant to look for something and not see it. Not because it wasn't there, but because you had trained yourself over years to look at the outline of a thing and assume you understood the whole. He thought about the pocket watch in the box. 6 months she had spent finding it. 6 months of searching. Because she had remembered when he had long forgotten a single moment on a November afternoon, a passing comment, a shop window, a thing he had admired and let go. She had carried it. She had carried all of it. Every small thing he had let fall she had picked up and held. Every promise he had made and not kept she had quietly moved around rather than confronting. Every dinner he had missed, every birthday he had glossed over, every time she had stood in a doorway waiting for him to notice she was there, she had absorbed all of it without complaint, without ultimatum, and channeled it somehow into something extraordinary. And he had called it her enjoying gardening. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. Outside in the side garden, a young girl he didn't recognize was crouching near the herb bed, pulling weeds with the careful attention of someone who had been taught to do it right. She couldn't have been more than 10. She hummed to herself as she worked. He didn't recognize her, but Eleanor, he understood, probably knew her name, probably knew her mother's name, and what her father grew on their land, and whether the family had made it through the last hard winter. Eleanor probably brought her out here and showed her which plants were which and why it mattered, and sent her home with something useful and never told anyone about it. Because that was who Eleanor was. That was who Eleanor had always been. And he had been so busy being Nathaniel Whitmore, Virginia Assemblyman, rising political figure, man of substance and consequence, that he had stood next to the most substantive and consequential person he had ever known. Stood next to her for 7 years and seen only a pleasant backdrop. He stepped away from the window. He went to his desk. He picked up the stack of political correspondence and moved it to the edge. Then he sat down, pulled a clean sheet of paper toward him, and for the first time in 7 years, Nathaniel Whitmore wrote not a political document, not a legislative brief, not a letter to a colleague or a governor or a land agent. He wrote a letter to his wife. He did not write it to apologize. He wrote it to ask. He wrote Eleanor. I went to the Hadley land today. I met a boy named Abel who told me that plants tell you what they need and you just have to know how to listen. I think he was telling me something I should have understood years ago. I am trying to understand it now. I don't know if it's too late. I don't know if you'll read this. But I want to know what dream did you stop telling me because you thought I was too busy to hear it. He set down his pen. Read it once. Then he folded the letter, sealed it, and called for a writer. He sent it to the one place James had mentioned the night before, quietly. The way you mention a thing when you want someone to hear it. An old farmstead to the north, near the Shenandoah foothills, where Eleanor's mother's cousin kept a house, and where Eleanor once before in a difficult year had gone when she needed to breathe. The writer left. The house settled back into its enormous silence. And Nathaniel Whitmore sat at his desk with his hands flat on the empty surface and waited for the first time in 7 years for something he could not simply schedule or manage or legislate into being. He waited for his wife to decide if he was worth answering. That night, he could not sleep. He moved through the dark house at 2 a.m, with a candle, restless in a way that was new to him. He had always been a sound sleeper. A fact Eleanor had once told him she envied lying awake beside him in the hours when the house was quiet and the weight of the day settled into her differently than it did into him. He hadn't asked her then what she thought about in those hours. He was asking himself now. He found himself in the dining room again. The table was cleared, the candles long extinguished. But he set his candlestick down in the center and pulled out his chair, and sat in it. Then he looked at the chair across the table. Eleanor's chair. I thought about every meal she had sat in that chair and listened to him talk about his work. About politics, about legislation, about the men he had argued with, and the arguments he had won. He had held court at this table for 7 years, and she had sat across from him and listened and asked thoughtful questions, and he had loved her for being such an excellent listener, such a warm and interested presence at his table. He had never once thought to wonder what she might have talked about if he had ever turned the conversation toward her. He reached into his jacket pocket and drew out the pocket watch. He had been carrying it all day without quite acknowledging why. He opened the case. Inside the watchmaker had engraved a small flower, a magnolia he thought though. In the candlelight he couldn't be entirely certain. He ran his thumb across it. She had asked for that, he realized. She had gone back to the shop and described what she wanted and asked them to add it. A magnolia. The tree that lined the drive of the house she had come to live in when she married him. The tree she walked under every morning. The tree that was in its own quiet and particular way as much hers as anything on this property was hers. His throat tightened. He closed the watch, set it on the table in front of him. He sat in the dark for a long time, and he thought about love, not the large ceremonial love that he had offered Eleanor at their wedding, and in the early years, the love of grand gestures and fine intentions, but the smaller, more demanding love that happened in ordinary hours. The love that required you to be in the room, to ask questions, to actually look at the person across the table instead of assuming that because she was there, she was all right. He had confused the feeling of love with the practice of it. He had felt it and assumed the feeling was enough. Margaret appeared in the doorway. She was in her nightcap and wrapper holding a candle of her own, and she did not look surprised to find him there, which suggested she had gotten up for exactly this reason, because after 31 years in this household, She knew when a light was burning in a room where a light had no business being at 2 in the morning. "Go to bed, sir," she said. "I can't sleep." "I know." She came in and sat down in Eleanor's chair, which was something she would never have done in the ordinary run of things, and which Nathaniel recognized as a deliberate act. "Let me tell you something I've never told you," she said, "because you never asked and I never thought it my place to offer. But," she looked at him across the table, "7 years ago, the night before your wedding, Eleanor sat with me in the kitchen for 2 hours. She was nervous. Not about the marriage itself, about whether she was ready to be the kind of wife that a man like you would need. Whether she was accomplished enough, educated enough. She'd grown up on a farm, you know. She worried the house staff wouldn't respect her. She worried she'd disappoint your family." Margaret paused. She said, "Margaret, I love him terribly. I just hope I'm enough for him." Nathaniel was very still. "And I told her," Margaret continued, "that a woman who worries about being enough is nearly always more than enough. It's the ones who never question it who fall short." She paused. She laughed at that. Beautiful laugh she has. Then she said, "I just hope he sees me. The real me. Not the person I can pretend to be at a dinner party. The real one." She stood up, smoothed her wrapper. "She's been waiting for you to see the real her," she said, "since the night before your wedding, sir. 7 years. She looked at him one more time. "The question is whether you can be the man she hoped you'd be. Not the man you've been. The one she hoped." She left. Nathaniel sat alone in the dining room for a very long time after that. The candle burned low. Outside, the Virginia summer moved through its dark hours, humid and vast and indifferent, the way the world always is when a man is sitting alone in a quiet room, reckoning with himself. He thought about Eleanor at 20 years old, sitting in a kitchen the night before her wedding, worrying not about her own happiness, but about whether she would be enough. He thought about what she had built quietly without his knowing, without his asking, in 5 years of mornings when he was elsewhere. A cooperative, a network, a thing that fed families and taught children and restored land that everyone else had written off. He thought about the boy with the corn seedling and the plant tells you if you know how to listen. He thought about a cracked pot repaired with gold and the idea that a broken thing could be made more beautiful by the mending, not less. He picked up the watch, put it back in his pocket, and he made himself a promise, not out loud because there was no one to hear it, and not in writing because promises on paper meant very little if the man making them wasn't different underneath. He made it quietly, in the dark, to himself, that he was going to listen. Not later, not tomorrow, not after the next session or the next negotiation or the next important thing on the long list of important things that had eaten 7 years of his marriage. Now. Starting now. Even if Eleanor never came back. Even if the letter he had sent came back unopened. Even if it was too late, and it might honestly be too late, he was going to become the man who listened, who asked, who stayed in the room long enough to understand who was in it with him, because the alternative was continuing to be the man who sent flowers. And he had sent 63 bouquets. And he had never once in 7 years thought to ask his wife what her favorite flower was. He knew now, he realized. He'd seen them in the hall vase every few days for years. Lavender. She always put lavender in the arrangement. He had looked at it 100 times and never seen it. The letter came back 3 days later, not unopened, not returned with silence. It came back with Eleanor's handwriting on the outside, her careful, deliberate hand, that he now recognized as the hand of a woman who chose every word with intention. And for a long moment, Nathaniel simply stood in the hallway, holding it, afraid to open it, the way you are afraid to open something that might confirm the worst thing you already suspect about yourself. Margaret stood in the doorway watching him. He opened it. Inside was a single line. You asked the right question, but asking is not the same as being ready to hear the answer. He read it twice, then a third time. Then he folded it and put it in his breast pocket next to the watch and stood there in the hallway with both hands pressed flat against the front of his jacket, as if he were trying to hold himself together from the outside. "Well," Margaret said. "She wrote back," he said. "What did she say?" He looked at the old woman. that I asked the right question." Margaret's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something that suggested the small, guarded loosening of a woman who had been braced for worse. "That's something," she said. She also said asking isn't the same as being ready to hear the answer. The almost smile faded. "That's also something," Margaret said, and left him standing there. He went to his study. He did not sit at this desk. He went to the window again, the side garden window, his new station, the place he seemed to return to now when he needed to think, and he read Eleanor's line one more time and tried to understand what she meant by it. He thought he understood, and then he thought he didn't, and then he thought he did, but in a different way than he had first supposed. She was not telling him that he was wrong to ask. She was telling him that she had heard questions from him before. Early in their marriage, she had told him things about her plans, her ideas, her observations about the land and the families around them, and he had listened in the half-attentive way of a man who is being polite, and then filed what she had said somewhere in the back of his mind and gone back to his own thoughts. He had asked then, in his way, in the way that asks without expecting to be moved by what it hears. She was warning him. If you're going to ask now, she was saying, be prepared for it to change you. Be prepared for the answer to land somewhere that matters. He was still standing at the window thinking about this when James came in without knocking. Nathaniel turned. James was not wearing his usual expression of careful diplomacy. He looked agitated, the specific agitation of a man who has just heard something he was not prepared to hear. "There's a problem," James said. "What kind?" "The political kind." James closed the study door behind him. "Alderman Marsh is at the Fredericksburg courthouse this morning. He's brought a filing against the Hadley Land Cooperative, challenging the use arrangement Eleanor negotiated with the bank. Claims the land is being occupied without proper legal authority, and that the improvements made are in violation of the receivership terms." Nathaniel's entire body went still. On what grounds? On the grounds that the bank receivership was never formally dissolved, and the arrangement Eleanor made was with a branch manager who didn't have full authority to grant it. James crossed the room toward him. "Marsh has been trying to get that land reclassified for development for 2 years. You know this. He wants to build a mill. He can't. He can actually if the legal arrangement is as informal as it sounds." James stopped in front of him. "Nathaniel, Eleanor made this deal herself 5 years ago, without involving your legal counsel, without involving you because she didn't think I'd listen," Nathaniel said flatly. James closed his mouth. "Or she didn't want to need me," Nathaniel said quieter. "She wanted it to be hers." He turned away from his brother, pressed his hand against the window frame. "How long does she have?" "The filing requests a court hearing in 10 days. If the arrangement isn't regularized before then, if someone with actual legal standing doesn't counterfile and formalize the land use, Marsh wins by default, and everything on that land gets cleared." Nathaniel did not hesitate. "Send for Caldwell," he said, his estate lawyer. "Today. Now." "Nathaniel." Now James. He was already moving toward the door. "And send a rider north. I need Eleanor to know what's happening." James caught his arm. "She won't want you riding in on a white horse to save her project. You know that. She'll think you're—" "I know what she'll think." Nathaniel stopped, turned, looked at his brother with the particular direct focus that in committee rooms made men revise their positions. "She'll be right. But the alternative is letting Alderman Marsh tear apart 5 years of her work in 10 days while I do nothing because I'm worried about my own reputation with my wife." He shook his head. "That's what the old Nathaniel would do. Figure out how to stay comfortable." James stared at him. "Send the rider," Nathaniel said, and walked out. The rider went north. Caldwell came by midday, a careful, precise man of 50, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead, and the habit of listening to a full situation before saying anything at all. Nathaniel laid out everything. The Hadley land. The arrangement Eleanor had made 5 years ago. The bank branch manager. The cooperative. The 5 years of improvements. Marsh's filing. Caldwell listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Do you have any documentation of the original arrangement?" I don't know what Eleanor has. We'll need it, or we'll need to reconstruct it. Who was the branch manager at the time? I don't know. Caldwell looked at him over his glasses. We'll need Thomas Reed then, and anyone else who was present when Mrs. Whitmore made the arrangement. Get them, Nathaniel said. There's something else, Caldwell said carefully. For you to counterfile with full legal standing, the arrangement needs to be formalized in your name. As the landowner of record, you're the one the bank will recognize. Which means Eleanor's cooperative will on paper be operating on land under your formal protection. A pause. Given what you've told me about how she built this, she may not receive that well. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. That's her decision to make, he said. My job right now is to make sure she has something left to decide about. He was in the middle of the third hour with Caldwell when Margaret appeared in the study doorway and said simply, She's here. Everything in Nathaniel went very still. Eleanor, he said. The rider reached her, Margaret said. She rode back herself, came in through the garden gate. A pause. She doesn't look angry, sir. She looks determined. He stood up. Caldwell began to rise as well. Stay, Nathaniel said. Give me a moment. He found her in the side garden, the one outside his window, the one she tended closest to the house. She was still in her traveling clothes, and she had not come inside the house first. She was standing in the middle of the garden path with her arms crossed and her chin up. And when she heard his footsteps, she turned to face him with the expression of a woman who had been riding hard for 3 hours and was not in the mood for anything other than the truth. She looked in that moment more like herself than he had seen her look in years. Tell me what he filed, she said. No preamble, no softness. A challenge to the land use arrangement, he said. On the basis that the original deal wasn't bank authority. Robert Henning, she said immediately. The branch manager. He had provisional authority, I checked at the time. I asked him directly. His provisional authority may not meet the legal standard for a long-term arrangement. Marsh's lawyers are sharp. She absorbed this. Her jaw tightened. How long? 10 days. If we can counterfile and formalize the arrangement before the hearing. She looked at him sharply. He met her gaze. I have legal standing. You don't, not independently, not in the eyes of the court. I know how that sits with you. I know it's not fair. But right now the question is whether Marsh tears this down in 10 days, and the only person who can stop that is me. The silence between them was not empty. It was packed with 7 years of everything they had not said to each other, every time she had not asked for his help, and every time he had not offered it, and all the distance that had grown in the space between those two failures. If you formalize it in your name, she said slowly, then it becomes yours, on paper. On paper, he said. Not in any other way that matters. And I will have a document drawn up separately today, this afternoon, stating clearly that the American Living Garden Society is wholly under your direction and authority, that your decisions govern it, and that my legal standing is a technicality of the current law and nothing more. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? She said. He blinked. Why what? Why does this matter to you? Her voice was not accusatory. It was genuinely asking, the way she might ask a plant what it needed, direct, honest, waiting for the true answer. 3 days ago, you didn't know what I'd built. You've never asked. You didn't come to a single opening, a single harvest, not one morning in 5 years. She tilted her head slightly. Why does it matter to you now? He could have said because it's yours. He could have said because you built it. Both were true. But what he said instead was, because I drove past that garden without knowing what it was for 7 years. Because I looked at you for 7 years, and I thought I was seeing you. And I was wrong. He paused. I'm not doing this to fix myself, Eleanor. I'm doing it because 40 families depend on what you built, and Marsh is trying to destroy it in 10 days, and I can stop that. That's all. She looked at him. The wind moved through the garden. You read my notebooks, she said. Didn't you, when you went out there? Yes. Which one? The fourth one. The one with the soil notes and the margin correspondence. He paused. The page where you wrote about the ground giving back what you put into it. Something crossed her face fast, barely visible, the kind of expression that appears and is controlled before it can be fully seen. But he saw it. She uncrossed her arms. "Bring Caldwell into the dining room," she said. "I have copies of everything. The original correspondence with Robert Henning. The survey notes, 5 years of yield records." She was already moving toward the house. "Marsh is going to find out that informal doesn't mean undocumented." He almost said, "That's my Eleanor." He stopped himself because it wasn't not his, not a possession, and he was learning the difference. Instead, he said, "Thomas is already coming in. He was present for the original negotiation." She stopped walking, turned to look at him over her shoulder. "You talked to Thomas." "3 days ago. He showed me everything." The expression on her face in that moment was one he could not entirely read, something layered and complex, surprised and guarded, and underneath all of it, something that might have been the very early edge of hope too, careful to fully emerge yet. "All right," she said, and went inside. For 4 hours, the dining room table, the same table set for an anniversary dinner that had gone uneaten, became a war room. Eleanor spread her documents across it with the efficiency of a woman who had kept meticulous records specifically because she had known somewhere in the back of her mind that the day might come when she would need them. Thomas Reed sat at one end with his own notebook, his large hands flat on the table, confirming dates and details in the steady, unhurried way of a man who knows exactly what he knows. Caldwell read and questioned and cross-referenced and made notes. James sat at the corner keeping a running list, and Nathaniel sat across from Eleanor and watched her work. He had attended legislative sessions for years, had watched some of the most practiced political minds in Virginia argue their cases. He had never watched anyone command a room the way Eleanor commanded that dining room table. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform authority. She simply knew everything, every date, every name, every quantity, every decision, and why she had made it. When Caldwell asked a question, she answered it before he finished the sentence. When a document was needed, her hand was already moving toward the right folder. At one point, Caldwell set down his pen and looked at her across the table and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, this is the most organized private land use documentation I have seen in 30 years of practice." Eleanor did not look up from the record she was reading. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "My father kept records of every season. He said the land doesn't lie, but your memory will." Caldwell looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked back at him and said nothing. He didn't need to. They had the counter-filing ready before sunset. Caldwell left for Fredericksburg at first light the next morning with enough documentation to stop Alderman Marsh's challenge before it reached a hearing. Thomas went with him, his steady presence, and 5 years of corroborating knowledge, a considerable weapon in any room. When the door closed behind them, the house went quiet again. Eleanor stood in the front hall. Still in her traveling clothes, she still had not changed, had worked straight through the afternoon without stopping. She looked tired now, in a way that was different from the exhausted steadiness she had shown at the window 3 nights ago. This was the tiredness of effort well spent of a person who had poured themselves into a task and now felt the cost of it in their body. Nathaniel was standing at the foot of the stairs. They were alone in the hall for the first time in 4 days. "You should rest," he said. "I know." She didn't move. Your room is how you left it," he said. "Margaret kept it. I didn't." He stopped. "I want you to know I didn't go in it. I didn't look at your things. I stayed out of it." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because I want you to know that I understand, even if it's a small thing, the difference between what's yours and what's mine, and that I'm trying to respect it." She was quiet for a long moment. "That's a different answer than I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I expected you to tell me everything was going to be fine, that Caldwell would handle it, and there was nothing to worry about, and come to bed, Eleanor." She looked at him steadily. "That's what you used to say. When something difficult was happening, and I was involved in it, come to bed, Eleanor. I'll handle it." He absorbed that. Let it land fully rather than deflecting it. "Was that bad?" "It wasn't bad," she said. "It was kind in its way. But it also meant you were handling it, and I was not a part of the handling." She paused. Everything I have ever built, I built by being part of the handling, by knowing the problem in its full dimensions and working on it myself. When you tell me not to worry, what I hear is that you don't think I need to know what's happening, that I can be kept comfortable and out of the way. He understood. He understood completely. I'm sorry, he said. And then before she could respond to that in the usual way, the way apologies had been received and folded away in this marriage for 7 years, he said, not the kind of sorry that expects you to say it's all right. The kind that means I understand specifically what I did wrong, and I intend to be different. He looked at her. You don't have to tell me it's all right, Eleanor. It wasn't all right. I know that. She stared at him. Something was happening in her face that she was trying very hard to control. Her jaw worked slightly. Her eyes were very bright. You said that to me the way I've always needed you to say it, she said quietly. I know. It took you 7 years. I know. The bright thing in her eyes sharpened. She pressed her lips together, and for a moment it seemed as though she might simply stand there holding herself together through sheer will. Then she said, I'm going to go change, and then I need something to eat. I haven't eaten since this morning. I'll ask Margaret. I know where the kitchen is, Nathaniel. But her voice had changed just slightly, just a shade. Not warm yet. Not closed either. Something in between. I'll find something myself. She went upstairs. He stood in the hall and listened to her footsteps overhead. The creak of the bedroom door. The sound of it closing, not locked this time, just closed. He breathed. Then he went to the kitchen himself, because he knew where it was too, and he asked the cook to prepare a plate and bring it up. And then he added quietly, almost as an afterthought, a small bunch of lavender from the garden on the tray. He didn't leave a note. He didn't need to. An hour later, Eleanor came back downstairs in her house clothes, a plain gray dress, her hair down rather than pinned, the traveling dust gone from her face and hands. She looked younger like this, he thought. More like the woman who had stood in her father's garden when he first met her, unhurried herself with no performance of any kind. She sat at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room. The kitchen table, which he understood as a deliberate choice, a choice of ordinariness over ceremony. And she had the plate from her room and a cup of tea, and she was reading one of her notebooks. He came in and sat across from her without asking. She looked up. He said nothing. She looked back at her notebook. He sat there. After a long silence, she said without looking up, Why are you sitting in the kitchen? Because you're here. She turned a page. That's a very simple answer. Yes, he said. Another silence. The lavender, she said. Yes. You noticed. It was not quite a question. I've been noticing a lot of things I should have noticed years ago, he said. I'm starting small. She looked up. Her expression was complicated, careful and open, at the same time the face of someone who wants to believe something and is trying not to want it too much, because wanting things too much is how you get hurt. Nathaniel, she said slowly. I need to say something to you, and I need you to hear it without arguing with it or trying to fix it. All right, he said. I don't know if I can come back, she said. To what we were. To the marriage we had. She held his gaze steadily, and her voice did not shake, but it also did not pretend. I'm not saying I'm leaving. I'm saying the version of this marriage where I wait quietly and forgive everything and ask for nothing, that version is over. It was over before I walked out of that door. She paused. If there's going to be something between us going forward, it has to be built differently. It has to be real. Both of us. Not just you being generous in a crisis and then going back to the way things were. I know, he said. I need you to actually know it, not just say it. Eleanor. He leaned forward slightly. I spent today watching you defend 5 years of work in a room full of men, and I understood for the first time exactly how much I have been underestimating you. Not on purpose, not with cruelty, but completely. He held her gaze. I am not going to promise you I'll never fail again. I am going to promise you that I am trying genuinely from the inside out to become the kind of man who knows what he has while he still has it. She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The fire had burned low. Outside the Virginia night was doing what Virginia nights did in summer, pressing in warm and dark, full of the sounds of things living and moving in the dark. Then Eleanor reached across the kitchen table and did something she had not done in 2 years, though he hadn't noticed it had been that long until this moment. She put her hand on top of his. Not a reconciliation, not a forgiveness, just contact, just I hear you, I'm still here. I'm going to sleep, she said. And tomorrow we are going to hear from Caldwell. And then we will see. She withdrew her hand, took her plate and cup, stood up. He sat still. She stopped in the doorway. Nathaniel. He looked at her. The lavender was the right thing, she said. Not warmly, not coldly either, just honestly. Small things done right matter more than you think. And then, you always thought it was the grand gestures, the flowers, the apology, the grand statement. She paused. It was always the small things I was waiting for. She left. He sat alone in the kitchen with his hand still flat on the table where hers had been. The fire made small settling sounds in the grate. The clock ticked. He thought about small things. About the way she replaced the hall flowers every few days. About Abel and the corn seedling. About the cracked pot and the gold repair, and the idea that a broken thing could be made more beautiful by how it was mended. He thought about what Margaret had said 3 nights ago, the one she hoped you'd be. He thought he was beginning very slowly to understand who that man was. The next morning brought the worst news they had not anticipated. The rider arrived before breakfast, not from Caldwell, but from the courthouse, directly hand-delivered, addressed to Nathaniel Whitmore, and stamped with the county clerk's seal. He opened it in the hallway with Eleanor standing at the top of the stairs watching him. He read it. He read it a second time. "What is it?" Eleanor said. He looked up. Alderman Marsh had not waited for the counter-filing. He had petitioned the circuit court judge directly. Judge Archibald Horn, a man who Nathaniel knew, a man who had his own complicated history with Nathaniel's family and had secured an emergency injunction, effective immediately. The Hadley Land Cooperative was to cease all operations pending the court hearing, now moved up to 72 hours from now. 72 hours. Eleanor came down the stairs. She held out her hand. He gave her the letter. She read it. He watched her face. She did not crumble. She did not cry. What happened instead was that her face went very still. The stillness that he now recognized not as emptiness, but as the opposite, as the particular quality of a woman gathering herself from every corner of her interior and bringing it all to bear on a single point. She lowered the letter. Horn, she said. Horn is Marsh's brother-in-law. Nathaniel stared. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. She folded the letter. I did. I knew it when I first started working on the land arrangement 5 years ago, and I made sure that everything I did was above legal reproach for exactly this reason. She looked at him. But Marsh knew something I didn't know 5 years ago. What? That he could wait. She said it quietly with a kind of cold clarity. He could wait until I built something worth destroying. Something large enough that tearing it down would matter. Something that people depended on. She paused. And then he could call in his brother-in-law and take it in 72 hours. The fury in her voice was quiet and contained and more frightening than shouting. Eleanor, don't. She held up one hand. Don't tell me it's going to be all right. Don't manage this. She looked at him directly. You said things were going to be different. Prove it. Right now. What do you actually know about Archibald Horn? He looked at her. And for the first time in 7 years of marriage, Nathaniel Whitmore did not reach for a reassurance or a solution or a smoothing over, he thought. He thought hard. He went through everything he knew about Horn appointments, political allegiances, what the man wanted, what he owed, what he feared. He thought about what Caldwell had said, and what Thomas knew, and what Eleanor's documentation could establish, and what a circuit court judge, who valued his reputation above almost everything else, could be made to understand about the risk of ruling wrongly on a thing this visible. And he said, Horn cares about his legacy more than he cares about Marsh. He doesn't want to be remembered as the judge who destroyed a cooperative that fed 40 families. He wants to be remembered as a man of law. Eleanor looked at him. Which means, he continued, that if this becomes public, if the people who depend on that land know what's happening and who's doing it, Horn will look twice before he rules. Eleanor was very still. You want to make it public. I think you should make it public, he said. I think the people who have worked that land for 5 years deserve to know what's being done to it. And I think a Virginia Circuit Court judge who is looking at 72 hours of public attention is going to move significantly more carefully than one who thinks this happens in a quiet room. She stared at him. That is, he added more carefully, if you agree. She stared at him a little longer. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen and called over her shoulder, "Get Caldwell back here, now, and I need paper." He followed her. And the small impossible thing that had begun the night before. The hand on his hand, the lavender on the tray, the small things done right, that thing held. It held through the next 72 hours, which would turn out to be the most consequential 3 days of their marriage. Not because of what was saved or lost on the Hadley land, though that mattered enormously, but because of who they were to each other inside those 72 hours. Because for the first time in 7 years, they were in a room together, both of them, and both of them were there. The paper Eleanor called for was brought to the kitchen table within minutes. She sat down, pulled it toward her, and began writing before Nathaniel had finished sending for Caldwell. Her hand moved quickly. None of the careful deliberateness of the letter she had written on their anniversary, none of the measured control of 7 years of quiet endurance. This was something different. This was Eleanor Whitmore finally fully without apology, using every ounce of what she knew. Nathaniel sat across from her and did not speak. He watched her write, and he understood with a clarity that felt almost physical, that this right here, this woman bent over a sheet of paper at a kitchen table at 7 in the morning with fire in her eyes, was who she had always been. Who she had been the entire time he was busy being important elsewhere. She wrote 3 letters in 40 minutes. The first to the families of the cooperative, every household that worked the Hadley land, written plainly and without legal language, telling them exactly what Alderman Marsh had done and what it meant and what the next 72 hours would determine. The second to the women in the neighboring counties who had built their own gardens through the network Eleanor had seeded over 5 years. Women he had never met. Women whose names he did not know. Women who had been corresponding with his wife in the margins of her notebooks for years, while he sat 40 feet away in his study, unaware they existed. The third letter she wrote slowly. She read it back to herself twice. Then she slid it across the table to Nathaniel without a word. He picked it up. It was addressed to Governor James Barber. He read it. She had not written it as a petition. She had not written it as a plea. She had written it as a factual account, precise, documented, measured of what the American Living Garden Society had accomplished in 5 years, what Alderman Marsh's injunction would destroy, and what it said about Virginia's commitment to the welfare of its farming families, that a circuit court judge could be deployed as a personal instrument to dismantle the work of 40 households on 72 hours' notice. She had written it the way Nathaniel wrote political briefs. Better, actually. Cleaner. More precise. He set the letter down. "You know the governor," she said. She wasn't asking. "I do." "Will he act in time?" Nathaniel thought carefully. He thought about James Barber, his priorities, his political sensitivities, what he cared about, and what he cared about being seen to care about. "He won't act directly," he said. "He'll move sideways. He'll make it known that he's aware of the situation. Which means Horn will know that Barber is watching." "Yes." She nodded once. "Then you need to deliver it yourself, today." He looked at her. "That's a 4-hour ride. I know how far away Richmond is, Nathaniel." He stood up without another word and called for his horse. He was at the door pulling on his coat when Eleanor came into the hall behind him. "Nathaniel." He turned. She was holding the letter out to him already sealed, and she was looking at him with the expression that he had been trying to learn to read, the layered, careful expression of a woman who had been disappointed enough times to be precise about hope. "Don't let him dismiss it," she said. "Don't let him file it away with his secretary and send you a note next week. Make him read it in front of you." I know how to be in a room with Barber. I know you do, she said. I'm telling you anyway. A pause. Because this time it matters to me. Not to your career. To me. He took the letter from her hand. Their fingers overlapped briefly on the seal. I'll make him read it, he said. In front of me. He rode for Richmond. He arrived in 3.5 hours, which meant he pushed the horse harder than was strictly advisable, and did not stop at the midpoint in the way he normally would. He arrived dusty and without the advance notice that a man of his position typically ensured before a visit to the governor's residence. The secretary at the front desk told him the governor was in a meeting. Nathaniel said, "Tell him Nathaniel Whitmore is here, and that it concerns the abuse of circuit court process in Spotsylvania County. Tell him I'll wait exactly 20 minutes before I take this letter to the Richmond Enquirer instead." The secretary stared at him. 20 minutes, Nathaniel repeated pleasantly and sat down. Barber appeared in 12. He was a tall man with the careful manner of a politician who had learned to listen without committing, and he came into the antechamber with the expression of a man managing an interruption until he saw Nathaniel's face, and then his expression shifted into something more attentive. "Whitmore," he said. "What in God's name?" "Read this," Nathaniel said, and held out Eleanor's letter. "Please, all of it, in front of me." Barber looked at him for a moment. Then he took the letter. He read it standing up, which was not how he typically conducted correspondence, and Nathaniel watched his face move through the text. The small shifts of expression that a careful man allows when he thinks he is only being observed by someone he trusts. When Barber finished, he folded the letter slowly. "This cooperative," he said. "Your wife built this." "My wife built this," Nathaniel said. "Over 5 years, with 40 families, on land that Alderman Marsh wants for a mill. And Archibald Horn, who is Marsh's brother-in-law, in case that detail did not make it to Richmond, has given her 72 hours before he rules against her." Barber was quiet. "I need you to make a telephone call," Nathaniel said. "Except we don't have telephones, so I need you to send a message to Horn that makes it clear this matter has come to your attention. Nothing official. Nothing that puts you in the middle of a circuit court proceeding. Just—" He met Barber's eyes. "Just enough for Horn to understand that the governor of Virginia is aware of what he's doing with his brother-in-law's property ambitions." A long silence. "Your wife," Barber said, "wrote this letter." "She did. It's the clearest piece of advocacy writing I've read in 6 months of state correspondence." "I'm aware," Nathaniel said. Barber looked at him for another moment. Something in the governor's face had shifted a subtle recalibration, the look of a man revising an assumption he had held for a while. "I've met Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly. 3 times at dinners. She was very gracious." "She is," Nathaniel said. "She's also this. Both things are true. I just didn't know about the second one until 4 days ago." Barber tucked the letter into his jacket. "I'll send a message to Horn by this evening," he said. "Not as governor. As a private citizen who is interested in the outcome of the Spotsylvania cooperative situation." He paused. "And Whitmore, make sure your legal man has the counterfiling in Horn's hands before tomorrow morning. I can buy you attention. I can't buy you time you waste." Nathaniel shook his hand. He rode back in 3.5 hours. When he came through the front door, Eleanor was in the hall, and the way she looked at him when he walked in, the way her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, the single controlled breath she took, told him everything about how the last 7 hours had felt to her. Waiting, not knowing. "He'll send word to Horn tonight," Nathaniel said. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Then, "Caldwell's been here for 2 hours. The counterfiling is ready. Thomas is going with him at first light." "Good." "James rode out to the Hadley land this afternoon, told the families what was happening." She paused. "They want to come to the courthouse." Nathaniel looked at her. "How many?" "All of them," she said. "Every family on the cooperative. They want to be present for the hearing." I thought about that. About 40 families standing outside a courthouse in Fredericksburg. About what that would look like to Archibald Horn, sitting behind his bench with the governor's message fresh in his memory. "Let them come," he said. She nodded. Then she looked at him more carefully. The dust on his coat, the particular set of his jaw that meant he had been in motion for hours without stopping. "Have you eaten today?" He thought about it. "No." "Come to the kitchen," she said, and she fed him. Not ceremonially, not with silver or candlelight or the formal arrangements of the dining room. She put a plate of cold meat and bread on the kitchen table and poured him water and sat across from him while he ate and told him what had happened while he was gone. Caldwell's strategy. James's ride out to the land. Margaret's information that 2 of the county newspapers had already heard something was happening and had sent inquiries to the house. She talked and he listened. He ate and he listened. He did not interrupt with better ideas. He did not redirect to what he knew. He simply listened, and when she was finished, he said, "What do you need me to do for tomorrow?" She looked at him. "What do you need?" he said again. "At the courthouse. From me. Tell me specifically." She was quiet for a moment. "Stand next to me," she said finally. "Don't speak for me. Don't manage it. Just stand next to me." "I can do that," he said. She stood up and took his plate. And as she turned toward the sink, she said quietly, almost to herself, "I know you can. I'm starting to think you always could. You just never tried." That night the house held its breath. Nathaniel could feel it, the particular quality of suspended time before something consequential, the way the air seems to thicken when too much is at stake. He sat up late in his study, not with political papers, but with Eleanor's 4th notebook, the one he had read at the Hadley land, reading it again more slowly this time. He read every page. He read the margin notes, the other women's handwriting. Their names signed at the bottom of their contributions: Hannah Coulter, Spotsylvania; Ruth Ames, Orange County; Della Farrow, Culpeper. Women he had never heard of, who had been in correspondence with his wife for years, building something across county lines in the margins of a book, while the men around them built things with legislation and money. He reached the last page of the notebook. It was not a record entry. It was not a yield calculation. It was a paragraph written in Eleanor's smallest handwriting, densely packed in the kind of script that means a person is writing quickly to keep up with what they're thinking. He read it. "I wonder sometimes if the work is a substitute. If I pour into the ground what I cannot pour anywhere else because there is no one there to receive it. I don't think that's entirely true. I think I would love this work regardless. But I also think the work has grown larger in proportion to the silence at home. That a woman who is truly seen doesn't need quite as much garden. And that I have built something quite large indeed." He sat with that paragraph for a long time. He set the notebook down carefully. He went upstairs. He stood outside the bedroom door, their bedroom where Eleanor was now sleeping, the door closed but not locked. And he stood there in the dark hallway with his hand not quite touching the wood, and he thought about 7 years of a woman pouring into the ground what she could not pour anywhere else. He did not knock. She needed sleep. The morning was going to be hard. But he stood there for a full minute, and in that minute he made a promise of a different kind than the one he had made alone in the dark kitchen 2 nights ago. That one had been about becoming a different man. This one was smaller and more specific. He promised that she would never again have to build gardens in order to feel seen. I went to the small room at the end of the hall, the room that had been used as a guest room and was perfectly comfortable, and he slept 3 hours and was dressed and downstairs before Margaret had started the fire. The morning of the hearing came in hard and bright. They rode to Fredericksburg together, Eleanor and Nathaniel and Caldwell and Thomas and James, and they did not talk much on the road. The silence between Eleanor and Nathaniel was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have said enough for now and are moving toward a shared thing. When they turned onto the main street of Fredericksburg, Nathaniel heard Eleanor make a sound, a small, sharp intake of breath. He looked up. The families of the cooperative were there, all of them. Not just the families who worked the Hadley land, others too. Women from the neighboring county networks. Eleanor had never told him existed in the way he now understood them to exist. Farmers who had benefited from the cooperative's knowledge sharing. A group of older men he didn't recognize, standing together with the self-conscious uprightness of people who don't normally attend courthouses and are not entirely sure of the protocol but have decided to come anyway. Abel was there. The boy with the corn seedling standing with his mother holding her hand, looking around with the wide, serious eyes of a child who has been told something important is happening and is taking it seriously. Eleanor's hand, which had been resting on the saddle beside Nathaniel's, moved. She reached across and gripped his arm. Not for support, not romantically. The grip of a person who has been surprised by something beautiful and needs to hold on to something real. He covered her hand with his. They rode the rest of the way in. Inside the courthouse, Archibald Horne was not the man Nathaniel had expected. He had anticipated defensiveness. Stonewalling. The elaborate procedural maneuvering of a judge who has been caught doing something he cannot quite be publicly accused of. What he found instead was a man of 60 who looked when Nathaniel and Eleanor walked into his chambers 20 minutes before the formal hearing as though he had not slept. Horne looked at Nathaniel first, then at Eleanor, then at the stack of documentation Caldwell set on his desk, then at the window through which Nathaniel was fairly certain he could see the gathering outside. He said, "Mr. Whitmore." Then, with a fractionally different tone, "Mrs. Whitmore." "Judge," Nathaniel said. A silence. "I received a communication last evening," Horne said carefully, "from a private citizen with an interest in this matter." "I understand," Nathaniel said. Another silence. Horne looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have reviewed the documentation submitted yesterday by your counsel. The original correspondence with the bank branch manager, the yield records, the survey materials." He paused. "I want to ask you something directly, if I may." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Of course." "The arrangement you made 5 years ago with Robert Henning, you understood at the time that it was informal in its legal standing. I understood that it was the best arrangement available to me, given the constraints I was working within," Eleanor said. Her voice was even and precise. "I documented everything carefully specifically, because I was aware that informal arrangements are vulnerable to later challenge. I hoped that 5 years of consistent, productive, beneficial use of the land would establish something harder to dismantle than paper alone." A pause. "I was wrong about that, but I was not wrong about what the land became." Horne looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel. "And you, Mr. Whitmore, you are prepared to formalize this arrangement under your legal standing as the neighboring landowner of record?" "I am," Nathaniel said, "with a separate agreement that establishes clearly that the American Living Garden Society remains under my wife's direction and authority in all matters." Horne glanced down at his desk, at Caldwell's documents, at something else, a letter Nathaniel thought that was partially visible beneath the stack. He couldn't see the seal from where he stood. "Alderman Marsh," Horne said slowly, "has submitted a supplementary filing this morning. He is alleging that the cooperative has created drainage issues on adjacent land that constitute a nuisance." Eleanor opened her mouth. Nathaniel put his hand on her arm, lightly, not stopping her signaling. She understood. She waited. "That allegation," Nathaniel said, "is documented to be false by the drainage survey conducted in the spring of this year, a copy of which is in the materials Caldwell submitted. Page 12. Caldwell reached forward and turned to page 12 without being asked. Horne looked at it. A long silence. Then Horne sat back in his chair. He took his glasses off. He set them on the desk, and he said without looking at either of them, "The emergency injunction was improperly expedited. I am satisfied that the legal standing question can be resolved through Mr. Whitmore's formal counterfiling, which I will approve before this afternoon's formal hearing." A pause. "The nuisance allegation will require a separate process, which Marsh is welcome to pursue through standard channels, which will take considerably longer than 72 hours. Another pause. "The cooperative may resume operations." Eleanor sat very still. Then she said, "Today. Today," Horne said. He put his glasses back on. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have been on this bench for 18 years. I want you to understand something." He looked at her directly. "What you have built is not invisible to this court. It may have been invisible to some people, but it is not invisible here." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Judge." It was not effusive. It was not gracious in the performed way she had been gracious at dinner parties for 7 years. It was direct. It was herself. They walked out of that courthouse into the August morning with everything intact. The families outside understood the moment they saw Eleanor's face. The change that went through the crowd was immediate. Someone called out, and then there was noise, the kind of collective noise that a group of people makes when something they were afraid of losing turns out to be safe. Abel's mother was crying. Thomas Reed stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes very bright, not smiling, not performing anything, just present. Eleanor walked into the middle of it. Nathaniel stood at the edge. He watched her move through the crowd, accepting handshakes, bending to talk to the children, pressing the hand of an older woman who was crying. He watched her be the person she actually was, fully and without modification, and he felt something so large and so specific in his chest that it took him a moment to find the word for it. Not pride, not the ambient possessive pride he had felt before. This was something else. This was the feeling of seeing someone clearly, truly clearly in their full dimensions, and being undone by how much you have missed. James appeared at his shoulder. "She did it," he said. "She did it 5 years ago," Nathaniel said. "I'm just the one who almost let Marsh take it." James was quiet for a moment. "That's the most honest thing you've said about this situation." "I'm working on honesty," Nathaniel said. They stood together watching Eleanor in the crowd. She had reached Abel and his mother. She was crouching down to the boy's level, saying something to him that made his serious face break into the sudden full-body grin of a child who has just been told something wonderful. "What did she tell him?" James said. "I don't know," Nathaniel said. "But I'm going to ask her." He walked forward. He moved through the crowd, the way he moved through political rooms, with purpose, with direction, except that the direction this time was not toward influence or opportunity or strategic position. The direction was Eleanor. He reached her as she was straightening up from her conversation with Abel. She turned and found him there, and her expression for one unguarded moment was simply surprised. "What did you tell him?" Nathaniel said. She blinked. "What?" "Just now. The boy. Abel. What did you tell him?" She looked at him for a moment, then at Abel, who was tugging at his mother's hand, already moving toward the hitching post, where someone had brought cookies in a basket, because even momentous legal victories go better with cookies. "I told him," Eleanor said slowly, "that the corn is safe, that he can go back and keep growing it." Nathaniel looked at her. "And that I'll be there tomorrow morning," she said, "to check the leaves with him." He held her gaze. "Can I come?" he said. She stared at him. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "To the garden. I'd like to come." The crowd moved around them. The August heat pressed down on the street, and somewhere a horse stamped, and the woman with the cookies was calling out that there were enough for everyone, and the world continued its business with total indifference to the two people standing in the middle of the Fredericksburg street. Eleanor looked at her husband. She looked at him the way she had looked at the plant in her father's garden, the first day he had ever seen her, with full attention, with the steady, unhurried assessment of a woman who knows exactly what a thing needs and is determining whether the conditions are right. She said, "You'll need to be up before 6. The ground is best before the heat comes in." "I know how to wake up early," he said. "You've never done it for this." "No," he said. "I haven't." Another moment. "All right," she said. "Come." She turned back to the crowd, but she did not move away from him. She stayed where she was, close enough that their arms touched, and Nathaniel Whitmore stood in the middle of his wife's world, her actual world, the one she had built and fought for, and nearly lost today, and he did not speak. He did not manage or direct or perform. He simply stood next to her, the way she had asked, the way she had always needed. And when Thomas Reed passed them on his way to speak to one of the farmers, he glanced over at the two of them standing together in the crowd, and something crossed his old weathered face. Not surprise, not satisfaction, but the quiet private expression of a man who has watched something grow through a difficult season and is now carefully beginning to believe in the harvest. That evening, they rode home together. The road was long, and the light was going golden, the way Virginia light goes in summer evenings, turning everything warm and particular. They rode side by side, not quite touching, not quite separate, in the careful new proximity of two people navigating something that is not yet healed but has at last stopped bleeding. At some point, Eleanor said, "I need to write to Hannah Coulter and Ruth Ames. They'll want to know what happened." "Do it tonight," Nathaniel said. "I'll make sure the writer goes first thing." She glanced at him sideways. "You'll remember that." "I'll remember it," he said. She looked at the road ahead. "I'm going to test you," she said quietly. "I don't say that as a warning. I say it as information. I have spent 7 years forgiving things I should have addressed. I'm not going to do that anymore. If you forget, or if you go back to the way things were, I won't quietly absorb it. I'll tell you directly." "Good," he said. "You say that now." "I mean it now," he said. "And I mean it specifically because I've read enough of your notebooks to know that you are better at documentation than I am. You will have evidence." He paused. "That is not a joke." She made a sound. It took him a moment to realize it was a laugh. Small, brief, more surprised than anything, as if it had escaped before she could decide whether to let it out. But it was there. It was real. And Nathaniel Whitmore, who had sent 63 bouquets and heard his wife laugh 1,000 times, understood in that moment that he had not truly listened to any of those laughs before. Had not noticed the particular quality of this one, surprised, reluctant, warm underneath, had not understood that her laugh was something she gave selectively to things and people that had actually earned it. He had earned a laugh. It was the most significant political victory of his life. He did not say that out loud. He simply rode beside her in the warm Virginia evening, and for the first time in 7 years, he was entirely, completely in the present moment. Not in Richmond, not in a committee room, not in the bright, busy future he was always building toward. Here, on this road, with Eleanor, and she was riding beside him, and she was real, more fully herself, more extraordinary than anything he had managed to build in 7 years of important work, and he was finally at last seeing her. The house appeared ahead of them in the late evening light. Margaret was on the front step. She watched them ride up together, and when they dismounted and walked toward the door, she held it open, without a word, but her face, that careful 31-year face, showed everything she would not say. She looked at Eleanor first. Eleanor met her eyes. "It's all right, Margaret," she said. "Yes, ma'am," the old woman said softly. "I can see that." Then she stepped back and let them both inside. He was up before 5. Not because Margaret woke him. Not because a rider arrived or a letter came or some piece of political business demanded his attention before dawn. He was up because he had set himself to wake the way a man sets himself when something matters enough that he doesn't trust sleep to release him at the right moment. He dressed quietly in the dark, washed his face, pulled on work clothes, not the clothes of Nathaniel Whitmore, Virginia assemblyman, but the older clothes he kept at the back of the wardrobe, the ones that had not seen daylight in years. He went downstairs. Margaret was already in the kitchen. She looked at what he was wearing and said nothing, which was its own form of comment. "Is she up?" he said. "Has been for 20 minutes, Margaret said. "She's in the side garden." He went out. Eleanor was standing at the edge of the herb bed in the early gray light, her hair braided back, her hands in worn gloves, checking something at the base of a plant, with the focused attention of a woman who has been doing this long enough that her hands know what they're looking for before her eyes confirm it. She heard him coming and looked up. She looked at his clothes. "Work clothes," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to the plant. "The lavender needs cutting back on the east side. It's going woody. If you're going to be useful, start there." He found the shears hanging on a hook by the garden gate. He would not have known where they were 3 days ago, and he started on the east side of the lavender bed, and he did not talk. She did not talk either for a while. They worked in the early morning quiet, the two of them, and the world came up slowly around them, the light changing the birds, starting the heat, beginning its slow climb. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet, unremarkable hour, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with the weight of everything that had happened in the last week. Just shifted. The way a door shifts when the wood settles, and it starts almost imperceptibly to swing more easily. Eleanor said, "You're cutting too much off the top." "Am I?" You want to take the old wood but leave the green growth. She came over and showed him her hand over his, briefly adjusting the angle of the shears. Like this. He felt the warmth of her hand, did not comment on it. Like this. Yes. She stepped back. You learn fast when you're paying attention. He heard what she was not saying. I'm paying attention, he said. She went back to her own work, but there was something different in the set of her shoulders now. A fraction less braced, a fraction more open. They worked for 2 hours. At the end of it, Eleanor pulled off her gloves and said, We should eat before we go out to the Hadley land. He looked at her. I told Abel I'd be there this morning. She met his eyes. You said you wanted to come. I do. Then she said simply, and walked toward the house. At breakfast, the kitchen table again. Not the formal dining room, which Nathaniel was beginning to understand as Eleanor's measure of intimacy. The kitchen table meaning, we are being ourselves right now. She ate and read through a letter that had arrived the previous evening from Hannah Coulter in Spotsylvania. He drank his coffee and watched her read. Hannah wants to expand the seed exchange, Eleanor said without looking up. She has a proposal for a regional collection asking participating families to save one variety each season and contribute to a central store. That's good, he said. It's very good. Eleanor set the letter down. It would need documentation. Records of provenance variety yield history. I know someone at the State Agricultural Office, Nathaniel said. A man named Pruitt. He's been pushing for exactly this kind of regional effort for 3 years. No one's given him a concrete proposal to work with. Eleanor looked up from the letter, slowly. The expression on her face was one he was becoming careful not to misread it. Looked at first glance like skepticism, but underneath it was something else. Something that was deciding whether to be hopeful. You know someone, she said. I know a lot of people, he said. I spent 7 years meeting them. I just haven't been using those connections for anything that mattered to you. He held her gaze. Let me write to Pruitt, today. No promises about what he'll do, but let me put Hannah's proposal in front of someone who might actually move it forward. A pause. You'd do that, she said. I'd like to. Another pause. All right. She pushed Hannah's letter across the table toward him. Read it properly. Don't skim. I won't skim, he said. He picked up the letter. He read it properly. The ride to the Hadley land was different from every other time Nathaniel had traveled that road in the past week. Shorter somehow, even though the distance hadn't changed. Or maybe it was just that he wasn't traveling it alone, and Eleanor set a pace that was unhurried but purposeful, and he matched it without thinking. When they came through the fence gap onto the cooperative land, it was already busy. The injunction had been lifted the previous afternoon, and the families had come back that same evening, not waiting for morning. Not waiting for official word, but coming back the way people come back to a thing they were afraid of losing, needing to see with their own eyes that it was still there. Abel was in his plot. Howe was crouched over his corn seedling with the same tremendous concentration as the first time Nathaniel had seen him checking the leaves exactly the way Eleanor had taught him. When he heard them coming, he looked up, and his face did the thing, the sudden full-body brightness of a child seeing someone he trusts arrive. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Then he looked at Nathaniel. And Mr. Whitmore. Good morning, Abel, Eleanor said, crouching down beside him. Show me the leaves. Abel showed her. Nathaniel crouched down on the other side of the row, and the three of them bent over a small corn seedling in the Virginia summer morning, and Abel explained very seriously what Eleanor had taught him about reading the color and the curve of the leaves, and Nathaniel listened to all of it. At one point, Abel looked at him and said, Do you know about plants, sir? I'm learning, Nathaniel said. Abel considered this. Mrs. Whitmore says learning takes patience, he said. She says you can't rush a thing that grows. Nathaniel felt Eleanor's gaze on him without looking up. She's right, he said. About most things. Abel nodded satisfied and went back to his leaves. Eleanor stood up. Nathaniel stood with her. They walked further into the garden, and she began her morning rounds, checking in with the families, examining the plots, making notes in the small notebook she carried in her apron pocket. Nathaniel walked beside her and did not try to run anything or direct anything or insert himself into what was clearly her domain. He watched. He listened. He asked when it seemed appropriate and stayed quiet when it didn't. At some point, Thomas Reed fell into step beside them. He walked with them for a while without saying anything. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "Rain coming in 3 days, maybe 4. "I know," Eleanor said. "The beans need to go in before then. I'll get the Faro boys on it this afternoon." "Good." A pause. Thomas Nathaniel knows someone at the State Agricultural Office who might want to see Hannah Coulter's seed exchange proposal. Thomas glanced at Nathaniel. A brief assessing look, the look of a man who has been watching this situation for a week and is deciding how much to update his assessment. "That right?" "Man named Pruitt," Nathaniel said. "Serious about regional agriculture. Been looking for a proposal with real documentation behind it." Thomas nodded slowly. Mrs. Whitmore's records would be the best documentation he's ever seen. "I know," Nathaniel said. Thomas looked at him for another moment. Then he said, "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," and walked away. It was the greeting he hadn't offered when Nathaniel first came out here a week ago. Nathaniel understood it for what it was. Not forgiveness exactly. Not quite welcome. But the first careful extension of something that could become either given time. He had not expected to care so much about Thomas Reed's good opinion. He found that he cared about it considerably. They stayed at the Hadley land until mid-morning. When Eleanor finally turned toward the horses, Nathaniel was beside her, and she glanced over at him with an expression he was learning to wait for the one where she was assessing him, not against who he had been, but against who he was right now in this moment, without the weight of history in it. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "You were useful," she said. He felt something loosen in his chest. High praise. "Don't push it," she said. But her voice was lighter. Not quite warm yet, not fully, but lighter. The difference between a window that's been painted shut for 7 years and a window that is beginning slowly to unstick. He did not push it. They rode back. The letter to Pruitt went out that afternoon as promised, with Hannah Coulter's proposal enclosed and a covering note in Nathaniel's most direct political language, laying out exactly what the American Living Garden Society had accomplished, and exactly what kind of institutional support would allow it to accomplish more. He did not put his own name on the proposal itself. He made it clear in the covering note that this was Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's work, and that Pruitt should correspond with her directly. When he told Eleanor this, she looked at the copies of the letters he handed her and read them carefully and said, "You didn't attach your name to my work." "It's not my work," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Most men would have," she said. "Made it a joint venture. Put both names. Made it something they were part of." "I know," he said. "I almost did. I caught myself." She looked at him. "You caught yourself." "I had to think about what you actually wanted versus what would feel good to me to offer," he said. They were different things. The expression on her face in that moment, the small involuntary shift of it, the thing that moved through her eyes and was controlled before it became something visible, was the clearest sign he had yet that he was slowly doing something right. She folded the copies of the letters and put them in her notebook. She did not say thank you. He did not need her to. The act of putting them carefully in the notebook was its own answer. 3 weeks passed. They were the most ordinary 3 weeks of Nathaniel's adult life. No political sessions, no dinners at the governor's residence, no correspondence that he allowed to eat the mornings. He was up before 6 every day. He went to the side garden and then to the Hadley land, and he learned with the patient slowness of a man who has spent 40 years learning the wrong things, what Eleanor had built and how it worked and what it needed. He made mistakes. On the 4th day, he tried to reorganize the storage shed at the cooperative without asking, and Eleanor found him halfway through and said with a precision that left no room for misunderstanding, "Put it back." He put it back. On the 9th day, he ran into Alderman Marsh at the county clerk's office and said several things that were politically effective and personally satisfying, but that Eleanor, when she heard about them from James, did not think had been necessary or wise, and she told him so directly at the kitchen table that evening. "You escalated it," she said. "He deserved it. He deserved it, and you escalated it. And now he has reason to feel publicly humiliated, and humiliated men look for ways to retaliate." She looked at him steadily. "You won the courthouse. You didn't need to win the street corner as well." He sat with that. "You're right," he said. "I know I am." He almost smiled. "You're not going to soften that at all." "I softened things for 7 years," she said. "I'm done softening." But the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. "You're right that he deserved it for what it's worth." "That's almost kind of you." "Don't push it," she said. Second time she'd said it. And the second time he heard it differently, not as a warning, but as something closer to a private language. A thing between two people who are learning each other again. He did not push it. On the 14th day, Pruitt's response arrived from the agricultural office. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table. Nathaniel watched her face move through it, the careful reading the assessment, the moment her eyes went back to reread a particular passage. "He wants to meet," she said. "I know. He mentioned it in his note to me." She looked up. "He wrote to you too." "Yes. He asked if you'd come to Richmond." A pause. "I told him that if he wanted to discuss your proposal, he should come here. That you had a working cooperative he could see in operation rather than reading about on paper." Eleanor stared at him. "He agreed," Nathaniel said. "He's coming in 2 weeks." She set down the letter. "You told a state official to come to me," she said. "I told him where the actual work was," Nathaniel said. "Which is here." The silence that followed was the longest they had sat in together since the night she came back. Not uncomfortable, not full of all the things they still needed to say, just full, the way a room is full when the right people are in it. Then Eleanor said, "I need to prepare." "I know. I'll stay out of the way." "No." She looked at him directly. "I need you to be there. When Pruitt comes." She paused. "Not to run it, not to speak for me, but I would like you to be there." I understood the weight of what she was offering. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Not the full, uncomplicated return to what they had been, because what they had been was exactly the wrong thing, and neither of them wanted to go back to it. This was something different. This was the beginning of something they had never actually tried. "I'll be there," he said. The day Pruitt came was clear and dry, and the cooperative was at its best, which was to say it was at work fully, the way Eleanor had always intended it to be seen. Not arranged for a visitor, but simply running the families in their plots, the children moving between the rows. Thomas directing the late summer harvest with the steady authority of 5 years of practice. Pruitt was a compact man of 50, with the focused energy of someone who has spent a career caring about something that most people consider minor. He walked out onto the Hadley land and stopped walking and stood still for a full 30 seconds. Then he turned to Eleanor and said, "How did you do this?" Eleanor told him. "For 2 hours," she told him. Walking and talking, showing him the documentation, introducing him to the families, letting him ask his questions and answering them without deferring to Nathaniel, without looking to Nathaniel for confirmation, without any of the performances of female deference that the time and the world expected. Nathaniel walked behind them, occasionally. Pruitt looked back at him, checking. Nathaniel thought whether the assemblyman's presence was supposed to mean something, whether he was supposed to be reading the situation differently. Each time Nathaniel gave him nothing, just walked, just listened. At the end of the 2 hours, Pruitt stood with Eleanor under the oak tree, where Nathaniel had first read her notebooks, and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to take your seed exchange proposal to the full Agricultural Committee. With your records and your documentation, it's the strongest case for regional coordination I've seen in my career." He paused. "I'd like to put your name on it, as the originating author." Eleanor said, "I'd like that." "Your husband's name as well, given his political—" "No," Eleanor said. Pruitt blinked. "This is my work," she said simply. "I appreciate Mr. Whitmore's support, but the proposal stands on its own documentation, not on whose name is attached to it." She paused. "If it needs a man's name to be taken seriously, Then the committee has a problem I can't solve for them. I'd rather know that now than after I've committed to the process." Pruitt looked at her. Then he looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. Pruitt looked back at Eleanor. And something in his face, the habitual assumption of a man of his time meeting a woman in a professional context, quietly reorganized itself. "It doesn't need a man's name," he said. "It needs exactly what it has." He held out his hand. "Mrs. Whitmore." She shook it. Nathaniel, standing behind them, felt something happen in his chest that he did not try to name. Something that was partly about Eleanor, and partly about himself, and partly about the strange long road that had brought them to this oak tree on a piece of land he'd driven past for 7 years without seeing. When Pruitt left, Eleanor stood for a long time in the quiet of the empty cooperative. The families had gone home. Thomas had gone. The afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in late August, going long and golden and particular, making everything look the way things look when they might become a memory. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. She did not look at him. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you asked me that first morning. In the letter." He waited. "You asked what dream I stopped telling you because I thought you were too busy." She paused. "I've been thinking about whether to answer it." "You don't have to. I know I don't." She turned to look at him. "I want to." She was quiet for a moment. "The seed library," she said. "Not just the exchange, but a permanent library. A place where every variety grown in this region is documented and preserved. Where families can come and find what their grandparents grew, what grows in this specific soil, what survives our specific winters." She paused. "I stopped talking about it. I stopped even letting myself think about it seriously around the 4th year of our marriage. Because every time I started to think about something large, I remembered that I would be doing it alone. And alone it felt too big." She looked at him directly. "That's the dream I stopped telling you." He held her gaze. "Tell me more," he said. She looked at him for a moment with that careful, assessing look. The look that asked whether he meant it, whether the conditions were right, whether this was real. Then she began to talk. She talked for an hour. She talked about the seed library, the way she had never talked about it to anyone without editing herself for an audience, without managing the size of it to fit in someone else's available attention. She talked about the building she had imagined, not large, not grand, but functional and permanent, with the right conditions for storage and the right system for access. She talked about which families had the oldest seed stocks in the region and how she would approach them. She talked about the documentation methodology she had already developed across 5 years of cooperative records. Nathaniel listened to all of it. He asked questions. Real questions, not the polite questions of a man performing interest. Questions about logistics, about legal standing for a permanent structure, about what Pruitt's committee might be willing to support, about how Thomas would manage the physical work of building alongside the harvest season. She answered all of them. When she finished, they were standing in the last of the afternoon light, and the oak tree was throwing a long shadow across the empty garden, and the Hadley land was absolutely still around them. "The legal standing for a permanent structure is simpler than the land use arrangement," Nathaniel said. "We can set it up as a charitable trust, separate from both of our estates, governed by the cooperative families themselves." "Can we do that?" "Caldwell can have the paperwork drafted in a week." She looked at him. "You're not making yourself trustee." "I wasn't going to suggest it." He paused. "I'd like to propose Thomas Reed, and Hannah Coulter, and one of the tenant family heads whoever the cooperative votes for." Eleanor stared at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, and turned away. But he caught the edge of her expression as she turned, and what he saw there, briefly unguarded real, made something in him go very quiet and very still. It was the look of a woman who has been surprised by something she had stopped allowing herself to expect. He did not say anything about it. They rode home in the last of the light, and he held the silence carefully, the way you hold something that is just beginning to be fragile and strong at the same time, not wanting to press too hard on the new growth. That evening after supper, Nathaniel went to the parlor. He stood in front of the shelves full of Eleanor's books and notebooks, and the child's drawing, and the gold-repaired pot, And he looked at them the way he had looked at them the first morning after she left, except that now he was not looking at them as the evidence of a stranger. He was looking at them as the record of a person he was beginning slowly to actually know. He reached out and straightened one of the notebooks on the shelf. Noticed his hand was steady. Eleanor came in behind him. She stopped when she saw where he was standing. She looked at the shelves and then at him. "You keep coming back to this spot," she said. "I know." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because I walked past it every day for 7 years," he said. "And it's where I understand most clearly what I was missing." She came to stand beside him. They stood looking at the shelves together, the accumulated evidence of Eleanor Whitmore's interior life, arranged quietly on the east wall of a parlor where her husband had never once stopped to look. "The pot," he said. "Yes. You did that on purpose, keeping it where you could see it." She was quiet for a moment. "I needed the reminder," she said, "that broken things can be mended in a way that makes them more honest than they were before. That the crack is part of the story, not something to hide." She paused. "I wasn't just thinking about the pot when I had it repaired." "I know," he said. Silence. Then Eleanor said, "Nathaniel." He looked at her. "I want to try," she said. Not quickly, not impulsively. With the careful, considered weight of a woman who has thought about a thing from every angle before she commits to it. "Not to go back. We can't go back and I don't want to. But forward. Something new." She held his gaze. "It will be different than it was. I need you to understand that. I'm not the person who waits quietly anymore. I'm not going to absorb things. If something isn't right, I will say so." "I know," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it," he said. "That's why I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to watch me. And I'm asking for enough time to show you that the watching is worth it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The seed library. I want to break ground before first frost." I understood what she was doing, not changing the subject, but moving toward the future. Building something concrete from this conversation, the way she built everything with purpose, with documentation, with the intention of making it last. "Then we need to meet with Caldwell this week," he said. "And Thomas. And you need to write to Pruitt about what the committee might support." "I know what I need to do," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I'm going to help anyway." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile. Not yet. But the motion of one, the muscle memory of warmth, beginning to return after a long absence. He reached out. He put his hand very carefully next to hers on the shelf. Not over it, not claiming anything, just beside it. The way you put yourself beside a thing you want to be near without demanding it acknowledge you. Eleanor looked at his hand. Then she turned her palm up, and she put her hand in his. Not the kitchen table contact of that first night. Not the arm grip of the courthouse crowd. This was different. This was chosen deliberate. Both of them fully aware of what they were doing. Two people reaching across 7 years of silence and missed moments, and 63 bouquets that didn't mean enough, and deciding that the reaching was worth the risk. They stood like that for a long time. Outside, the Virginia night was warm and full of sound. The familiar summer sounds, the whippoorwill and the crickets and the distant creek running over its stones, the way it had run for 1,000 years before either of them existed. The house settled around them the way old houses do, with the small sounds of wood and weight and time. Margaret passed the parlor doorway. She saw them. She kept walking. But in 31 years of service, in all the things she had witnessed in this house, the grief and the celebration, and the long ordinary days between them, she had never moved past a doorway quite as quietly as she did in that moment. As if she understood in the particular way of someone who has watched people for a lifetime, that some things are too new and too real to be witnessed even by someone who loves the people inside them. Nathaniel felt Eleanor's hand in his, and he thought about the pocket watch in his chest pocket, which he had been carrying every day since the night he found it. He thought about the magnolia engraved on its case. He thought about 6 months of searching for a thing that mattered because she had been paying attention when he wasn't. He thought about Abel, and the corn seedling, and the plant tells you if you know how to listen. I thought about the cracked pot and the gold repair, and the idea that a broken thing made honest by its mending was more beautiful than a perfect thing that had never been tested. He thought about Eleanor at 20, sitting in a kitchen the night before her wedding, hoping to be seen. He tightened his hand around hers. She did not pull away, and that was how it began again. Not with a grand gesture, not with 64 bouquets, or a speech, or a formal declaration of anything. It began in the parlor of a Virginia plantation house on a warm August evening in 1817, with two people standing in front of a shelf full of evidence of an unwitnessed life, holding hands in the quiet, choosing carefully with full knowledge of the cost and the risk and the work ahead to try. The seed library broke ground before first frost. Nathaniel was there the morning they turned the first soil, standing beside Eleanor, not in front of her, his coat dusty, and his hands in work gloves, and his eyes on his wife's face, as she drove the first stake into the ground, with a precision and satisfaction that he recognized now as the look of a woman doing exactly what she was made to do. Thomas Reed stood to her left. Hannah Coulter had ridden down from Spotsylvania for the occasion and stood to her right. The cooperative families were gathered around them. Abel was in the front because of course he was. Pruitt had sent a letter of official support from the Agricultural Committee. It was in Eleanor's apron pocket. Nathaniel had not put his name on anything. He was simply there. When Eleanor pulled the stake free and stood back to look at the marked ground, the outline of what would become the first regional seed library in Virginia, she turned and found him watching her. She did not ask him what he was thinking. She already knew. She had learned over the slow and careful weeks since the courthouse how to read the particular quality of his attention when it was fully on her. The real attention, not the political attention or the performative attention, but the kind that meant, I see you, I am here. She had waited 7 years for that look. She was not going to rush past it now that she had it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to her work, and Nathaniel Whitmore, who had once stood in rooms full of powerful men and believed that was where important things happened, stood on a piece of recovered land in the Virginia summer and understood completely without reservation, in a way that reached all the way down to whatever part of a man is truest, that the most important thing he would ever do was learn to be worthy of the woman who had been building the future 20 minutes from his front door while he was busy being significant. She had not needed him to be great. She had needed him to be present. And presence, it turned out, was not a lesser thing than greatness. It was the only thing that had ever mattered. The ground was ready. The seeds were coming. And Eleanor Whitmore was exactly where she had always been, building something that would last in the particular and unshakable way of a woman who knows what she is doing and no longer needs anyone's permission to do it. This time, she was not doing it alone.